Governor Mills, thanks for joining us from Washington.
Thank you, Phil.
I'm less interested at this point in the reason you did attend the National Governors Association meeting at the White House. I'm more interested in knowing what happened. Was anything accomplished? Did you have any interaction with President Trump this year? Did you have a chance to stand up for Maine?
Well, actually, the president came in the room and he spoke for about 45 minutes in a fairly rambling fashion. And it was difficult to pinpoint what his subject matter was, honestly. But I listened patiently. He kicked the press out early on. And then he was going to ask for questions and everything. And I was ready to ask him about the tariffs in particular, because I'm concerned about them and the effect on the Maine economy. But at that moment, he got a note from someone who told him about this U.S. Supreme Court decision, 6-3 decision, saying that his tariffs were illegal and unconstitutional. So he got pretty upset with that, called it a disgrace, and then he left the room in order to go prepare a statement in response to the U.S. Supreme Court decision.
Well, what's your response to the U.S. Supreme Court decision? You've been very outspoken trying to mend relations with Canada, right? During President Trump's first year back in office, welcome signs, trying to keep, diminish the effects of really what was a boycott against the United States because of the tariffs, and also President Trump's statements that he wanted Canada to be the 51st state. What's your reaction to the Supreme Court decision?
I've said all along, I think the tariffs were damaging to our economy. The tariffs themselves imposing an extra cost on retail goods of all sorts, plus the devaluation of the dollar by 13%, which is a result of those tariffs. I've also said all along, as a matter of constitutional law, he does not have that broad authority. You know, the Wall Street Journal last year even said these tariffs are not tariffs, they're a big tax heist. And they have been a tax on American people, a tax that he's not calling a tax, but clearly is a tax to the tune of millions of dollars. And so it's the Congress under the Constitution that has the authority to issue tariffs and or taxes, and not the president, not the chief executive. The Congress has only delegated that authority in targeted circumstances. This is not one of those circumstances. They basically said his declaration of emergency was illegitimate, and that he did not have the broad power of imposing tariffs willy-nilly, like tumbleweeds, in the sky, not knowing where to land. That he did not have that authority to impose tariffs willy-nilly. And we know from last week alone that he was imposing tariffs arbitrarily based on who he liked and disliked from one day to the next, what country he favored, what country he didn't like. And it was very personal and very arbitrary. So they ruled against him justifiably. I was pleased that the Chief Justice of the United States authored that opinion.
What do you expect the impact then will be on Maine residents, our pocketbooks, and tourism and other trade aspects with Canada?
Well, we'll see. I mean, those tariffs all along have increased the cost of home construction, for instance. The tariffs on steel and aluminum, they've increased the cost on cars and trucks, the cost of car repairs. When you go get your truck repaired and you need an extra part, it's not automatically coming in, going to be shipped because of the tariffs and the materials that are in those parts. It's been increasing the cost of the groceries. I talk to people every day. When I go to the grocery store, you see increasing prices on just about everything. And that's basically due to the tariffs. We import a lot of goods, we export a lot of goods. This will make it a little easier to live and pay bills. The cost of living hopefully will be improved. But now the issue is, what's the remedy? And I've always wondered what the Supreme Court was going to do about the remedy. And we'll see what happens next. I think there has to be a reimbursement, has to be restitution to the retailers and the distributors and the American people who've paid the cost of these taxes for nearly a year.
When you speak about cost relief, of course, before the state legislature now is your proposal to have $300 rebate checks to most Maine residents. It would cost over $200 million. Republicans tend to prefer a straight up income tax. We're also hearing some Democrats aren't completely on board with that as a priority. What's your feeling about how that might play out and how it should play out?
Well, we've seen it before. We've done it before during times when the cost of living was high and the price of heating oil, things of that were high, or during the pandemic. We've done it before and made people appreciated it. It's in the legislature's hands right now, and I'm happy to negotiate with them and see what makes the most sense. But I think it makes sense to give money back to people.
Do you think $300 really makes that big a difference? It feels like that's a monthly CMP bill. Thank you, pay it for me. But $200 million, looking at the aggregate, you can do a lot with $200 million, right? Like your housing proposal from the state was just 70 million. You could triple that with that $200 million from the budget stabilization fund, hypothetically.
We're doing a lot more on housing in other respects as well. The bill that went through last year to allow us to do more for first home buyers, that's happening. The bill that gave more money to Maine housing, and the bill that gave more money for shelters and modular housing and things of that sort, and the rural rental program is very important. So we're proposing to continue those programs. It's not a separate thing completely, the 70 million. It adds on to existing programs. There's a lot more going on. I think my administration has put forward about $310 million last I knew towards housing. It's the biggest investment in housing ever in the history of Maine, and will continue to do that because I know that young families are still struggling to find housing in Maine, and we want to help them out.
Just to go back to the NGA meeting, you had no direct interaction with the president. He didn't call you out. You never really talked with him at all today, right?
That's correct.
Okay. I wanted to come back to that because the see you in court moment from a year ago was over the transgender issue and the administration's insistence under Title IX that transgender girls not be allowed to participate in girls' sports, which is contrary to the Maine law. That was your whole point last year. But I'm not as clear as what your position is on the underlying issue. In other words, we have a referendum that's likely going to be on the ballot. The petition's pending with the Secretary of State right now that would do what Trump wants, which would ban transgender girls from participating in high school sports. What's your opinion on that as a policy?
Well, I'm not sure it does what the president was talking about doing. I'm not sure at all. And I'm happy to look at that. I know the legislature is going to be looking at the language of the bill to see how broad it might be and whether or not it impedes a lot of other things going on. I want to see as many young people engaging in sports as possible. It's my bottom line, basically. I say that having brought up five daughters who all were in public schools and who all played sports. And it made their lives healthier, more robust, and better. And my husband was a tennis coach, a high school tennis coach. And I could see the light in those kids' eyes every day when they got to do something they felt good about and be part of a team. So I hesitate to suggest that any kid should be left out of sports. That's sort of a fundamental belief of mine.
Right. I mean, the petition does say, well, there'll be co-ed sports, but I'm not familiar with that there are that many co-ed teams, in the state of Maine.
There's a young woman who was at Oceanside High School, I think last year, who won the state wrestling championship 2 years in a row. And she won it last year by beating 3 boys. So as far as gender equality, we're there. We're getting there. And you know what? The other thing I think about is the proponents of that bill. Here's what makes me curious. The proponents of that bill say that they're doing this to protect girls and women. Well, I think if they want to really if they're sincere about protecting women and girls, then they ought to back fully funding domestic violence shelters. They ought to be fully in support of sexual assault services. They ought to fully support women's health care, including robust reproductive health care. I haven't seen that from the people who are supporting that measure.
Last question, and this is something that Dr. Nirav Shah talked about yesterday. Obviously, he's running to succeed you for governor. He said that he would, as governor, stockpile the abortion pill, mifepristone, because just in case was the phrase he used, just in case the US FDA during the Trump administration were to revoke its licensure. I remember you talking about that as something you might do in 2023. Has your administration done that, or will it do that?
I know, but I think there are efforts, there have been efforts in the state to make sure there's an adequate supply, a backup supply.
Okay. Let me just throw this one in since we're still rolling and you haven't pulled the cane. We've heard you talk a lot about the end of the Affordable Care Act subsidies, the enhanced premiums, the enhanced subsidies that made premiums more affordable for so many Mainers. Thousands of Mainers have dropped out this year, and millions across the country, perhaps.
Right.
Okay. So what is your view when you say you're for universal health care? How we get there, not just going back the way the ACA was, but are you, for example, for Medicare for all, which a lot of Democrats talk about in this campaign?
Both the term. I'm for universal health care. And first and foremost, the problem that's immediately before us is fixing the Affordable Care Act stipends, the tax credits, which thousands of people in Maine and millions elsewhere have depended on. They've gone out on their own, they've gone out on a limb to start a new business, to employ other people, or to become self-employed or gig employees. And farmers have depended on that as well. All kinds of people have depended on those tax credits to keep paying their health insurance. And now they're seeing those health insurance rates double, triple, quadruple, and they're having to drop insurance because it's simply unaffordable. I hear from people every day who tell me about that. And it's appalling that the United States Senate has not been able to fix that, come to the table and fix that and continue the tax credits. On the broader question of healthcare generally, look, the ACA, as controversial as it is and has been, was only a Band-Aid on the whole business, the whole issue of healthcare. I believe in universal healthcare because everybody in America needs healthcare. Healthcare is a human right, and that is my belief. How you do it, I want to look at what other countries are doing. Belgium has a plan that's kind of interesting. Other countries have provided a baseline of healthcare with some options, and I think it's important to look at all possibilities.
A lot of those countries have single payer, if not Medicare for all. What about Medicare starting at 55 instead of 65?
Well, a lot of proposals have been along those lines to lower the age for Medicare first, and that does help a certain large segment of the population. I'm happy to look at that as well as a lot of other things to make sure that all Americans have access to affordable health care.
Governor Mills, thank you very much for your time, and we'll
Thank
see
you,
you
Bill.
in Maine.
All right, thank you.
Have a good day.